Hello, good morning. Welcome to Bad Sydney Crimes Festival 2021. It's fantastic to be back in a room with a live audience of crime lovers. Welcome to all of you joining us on Zoom, including those of you throughout New South Wales watching from your local library or from home, courtesy of your local library. My name's Nicole Abadee. I'm delighted to welcome you today to the Metcalfe Auditorium for this conversation with writer Kathryn Heyman, who's here with us in the room, and journalist and writer Louise Milligan, who's up on the big screen, about the brutal cost of seeking justice. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respect to their elders, past and present. There's also a few short admin announcements. As you will have seen, we're following COVID protocols. We're all double vaxxed and we should all keep our masks on except when eating or drinking, or in our case, when we're on the stage. Social distancing means there are restricted numbers in the room. Please try to respect the protocols. Hand sanitizer is available at the door, and please let a volunteer know if you're feeling unwell. Please mute your mobile phones and don't record the session. If you're taking photos, could you please turn off the flash? Feel free to share on social media at Bad Crimes Sydney or hashtag Bad Crimes Sydney, I'm sorry. We have about 10 minutes at the end for questions. If you're joining us on Zoom, could you send your questions through using the chat function about 20 minutes before the end of the session, and we'll do our best to include those. So now it's my great privilege to introduce the two speakers that we have with us today, and I'll start with Kathryn Heyman. Kathryn is a novelist, essayist, screenwriter and teacher. She's written 6 novels and has won literary awards in Australia and internationally. Kathryn was the founding director of the fiction program for Faber Writing Academy and is now the director of the Australian Writers Mentoring Program. She's also an honorary professor of humanities at the University of Newcastle. Her memoir, Fury, which we'll be discussing today, is her first work of non-fiction. It was published earlier this year by Allen and Unwin and has been receiving enormous critical acclaim. Kathryn, welcome.
Thank you.
Now I'd like to welcome Louise Milligan. Louise is an investigative reporter for ABC TV's Four Corners. She's also the best-selling author of Cardinal, The Rise and Fall of George Pell, which won the 2017 Walkley Book Award as well as other awards. Today we'll be talking to Louise about her second book, Witness, an investigation into the brutal cost of seeking justice, published by Hachette in 2020. Witness has won the Victorian Premier's Literary Award People's Choice Prize. It was shortlisted for the 2021 Stella Prize, and just a few weeks ago was longlisted for the 2021 Walkley Book Award. Louise has also won many awards for her journalism, including 2 Walkleys and the prestigious 2019 Freedom Medal. Louise, welcome to this session.
Thanks for having me.
So what I want to start by talking about is how each of you ended up in a situation where you became a witness in a criminal trial, something you've both had personal experience about. Could you start, each of you, and we'll start with Kathryn, by telling us how that came about? How did you come to be a witness in a criminal trial, Kathryn?
Now have we got me? Okay. Can you hear me now, Louise? Okay. So at 20, I was sexually assaulted by a taxi driver. I was encouraged by another taxi driver to pursue that through the court system. And that was a decision that had enormous repercussions on my life.
Louise, what about you? How did you come to be involved in the criminal justice system as a witness in a criminal trial?
I had broken the story about the complainants against Catholic Cardinal George Pell, and for the ABC 730 program. And then those allegations came to be part of my book, Cardinal, The Rise and Fall of George Pell. And when he had his criminal trial that, was looking at those allegations, because the defence was seeking to look at the differences between, or perceived differences between, the complainant's account to the court and to the police and what they told me, I was cross-examined for a full day by Robert Richter QC, who was Cardinal Pell's defence counsel of some renown in his committal proceeding.
You said, I think in your book, the witness of first report, you were the first person that this particular complainant had spoken to. And that meant that at the committal proceeding, your evidence was really very important.
Yes, there was a man who was one of the complainants who had never told anyone else in the world, actually, about what had happened to him. And yes, we have in the law, there's a category known as the witness of first complaint, which is the first person that was told the allegation. So that's how I started off being a witness. But to be honest, that ended up being only a very small part of what I was cross-examined about, because I had spoken to a number of these men, and so they were seeking to discredit their accounts.
So I want to ask both of you then to talk a little bit about your experience in the witness box, what it was like to be a witness. For both of you are witnesses for the prosecution, for the Crown that's bringing the criminal proceedings. Kathryn, I'm going to start with you. Could you, I know it was a long time ago for you, it was 35 odd years ago, I think, but can you in broad terms describe your experience in the witness box?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'd start with is by saying in broad terms, as we know, the way the legal process works, or the way law works in Australia, is in essence combative. That's the structure actually of the court. It's built on, in my opinion, that Oxford Union model of aggressor and debate. So inevitably, as a witness, as someone standing, and in my case, someone actually effectively bringing the case, so I was a witness for the Crown, what that means is that it is built into the structure that the person standing in the witness box is being interrogated, and for someone who is who has experienced sexual assault or any sort of assault, actually, what that means is that process of interrogation by definition and by the very structure, actually, in the whole system, becomes combative. I can't see how it could be another way. So my experience was, as it is for so many, I was going to say women, but women and men who bring sexual assault cases, it's brutalizing. It's absolutely brutalizing and cliche ridden, frankly, in my experience. And I would like to think that has changed. But of course, over the last few years, I've watched and read and spoken with women who have been involved in more recent cases. It doesn't appear to have changed. It still appears to be brutalizing. It still appears to be combative.
Kathryn, what sort of questions were you asked, and did they take you by surprise, or do you think you were fully prepared?
I was not fully prepared in any way, not for any of it. And the questions I was asked, I mean, when I wrote Fury, my memoir, which is not actually a memoir of a sexual assault trial, nor of a sexual assault case, but a memoir of remaking and reinventing myself and my story after that. But actually, as I recorded moments of the trial, moments of dialogue, if you like, I had to really check in with myself. I had to go and look at the records, because it seemed, as I said, almost so cliche written that I was being asked things like what underwear I was wearing. I was being asked repeatedly about how much I had had to drink. Short answer, a lot. That
was very much used against you, wasn't it? The fact that you'd been drinking, that you'd had a lot to drink, right from the moment, in fact, that you reported it. The second taxi driver picked you up, took you straight to a police station. Mm-hmm. Just tell us a little bit about what happened, about your first, really, this was your first encounter with the justice system, was the old curmudgeon of a policeman that you dealt with at the station. What was he like? Absolutely.
So let me first of all paint a little bit of a picture. So I had been at a party. I was 20. I thought of myself as having a certain kind of edgy style. So I'd taken my top that I was wearing, and I'd got some of those crimping shears, that's it, that have the zigzag, and I'd cut it. I thought I needed more cleavage. So, it's 20. And so that's what I was wearing, and a little skirt and boots, I thought were pretty fab. And I had, as I said, had a lot to drink. So when I went into this police station, taken by this other lovely taxi driver who was very keen that I would seek justice, the first response when I said, I have been, and then I stopped and said, I think that I have been raped. And he said, well, I don't know about that, girlie, but you've certainly been drinking. Which, as I wrote it, I kind of thought, surely, you know, I really had to check in, because it seems like that's the line you would write if you were making up the curmudgeonly police officer, right? And then someone else in the writer's room would say, you know, can we give him a bit of shade? Yeah. You know, do we have to be so? No, he was the full cliche. Yeah.
And that was something that came back to bite you at the trial as well. The fact that the first words you'd used, and you were clearly just being careful, but you said, I think I've been raped. You were really battered around in cross-examination about why you'd said think, weren't you?
I absolutely was. And the reason that I said think was exactly that I had that moment of trying to pause and go, okay, this now becomes a kind of legal process. So try to be precise, try to be, what actually has happened? What has occurred? Is this what this is called? I had a whole kind of swarm of questions about what had physiologically occurred. And it was actually only years later, as I wrote the book, that I came to understand that you know, I didn't need to use the word think.
And Kathryn, there was also at the trial a lot made of, you know, again, you couldn't script it really, but what you were wearing, the fact that there was a big gap of skin between where the skirt ended and where the boots started, but in particular about the underwear that you were wearing. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. Let's all talk about my underwear. I had been given a pair of, you know, those sort of quite 1930s, I'll dig into it, a pair of 1930s kind of French knickers, silk, lovely, that are like little shorts. That's what I was wearing. So they were held up in the courtroom, like with sort of pegged open. So you could really, so the jury, everyone, including, in fact, of course, the perpetrator who was in the room, you are invited to see the picture, to imagine how easy the access might be.
Kathryn,
sorry to be so graphic.
You'd met the Crown prosecutor before, but he, and it was a he, didn't really spend much time with you at all preparing you, did he, for what you had in store in the witness box? No, it was very, very brief. Yeah, very brief, to the degree that when I came to write those moments in Fury, which, as I said, don't form at all. There are moments in the memoir, but they were crucial, of course, to get them right. And I was very aware as I was writing them that I be precise in terms of what I was recording and recalling. There was very little time. I mean, I would struggle to put an actual allocation of minutes, but certainly I don't think it was an hour. No, you said in the book that it was only a very short time. And you just weren't expecting this at all, were you? You weren't expecting how bad the cross-examination would be, how much it would be a test or a trial of your own character. You said that you were told several times in advance, just remember, you're not the one who's on trial. But how did you feel? I was told that several times. And again, as I was writing Fury, I kept kind of thinking, because I would use the phrase in my early drafts of my trial. And it was only with a later reading that a reader, it might have been my publisher, said, you know, that's not quite right. That is it very much felt that I was on trial. And I am fairly sure that it still does for people now. So I was quizzed on, you know, what I was wearing, how much I'd had to drink, my sexual history, my sexual habits. I'd been a drama student. So when I did become distressed, the cross-examining barrister said,
what is it that you've been doing? So so there was a kind of, no matter what I did, I was effectively on trial.
And Kathryn, it was a terrible outcome for you. After a 3-day trial, the taxi driver was found not guilty. How did you feel? Should we move on? Angry?
That's so interesting. I have had no feelings about that.
Can we move on? Yeah. Something really interesting. This will make you all smile. Later in the book, Kathryn fantasizes about getting hold of a machete. She thinks about what she's going to do with this machete. And something I found really surprising and interesting was you imagined holding that machete up to the face of the defence barrister who had cross-examined you, or the policeman who you'd first spoke to. And you said in your book, in Fury, you wanted to find them more than the taxi driver. And I found that extraordinary. And I wondered, why was that? Is it because, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but a lot of the victims, and Louise, we're going to come to talk to you in a moment about all the complainants that you spoke to, but so many complainants in sexual assault cases say that the process of being cross-examined and of appearing as a witness in the criminal trial was actually more traumatic than the events themselves. And I wondered, is that how you felt, that the experience of being in court and that brutal cross-examination, that was worse, in fact, than the actual assault in some ways?
I don't think I could say it was worse, but I think that the reason in the book I said, if I could do that now, and I do go on to say, I don't have a machete. All I have is words, thousands and thousands of words. So I guess what I wanted was to be able to re-speak, to remake the story. So, and of course, that was what I did. That was my claiming of power. And I think that's the reason that in that moment, I say it's them that I want. Because my experience there was to do with power. Of course, a sexual assault, a rape, is very much about power. But after that event, I did not feel less powerless than the perpetrator, oddly.
Less powerful.
Less powerful. Yes, no, I didn't. Thank you. I appreciate the correction. In my life, I didn't feel that he was a more powerful person than I was. But I did feel that the power imbalance with the legal system was one that was crushing.
But there's a happy ending to this story, as you can see by seeing Kathryn here today. What, after that terrible experience of the trial, the assault and then the trial, you went on and remade yourself, didn't you? Could you talk a little bit about that and the extent to which you were driven to do that by the experience, your crushing experience with the justice system?
Yeah, look, this isn't something that I would necessarily recommend, you know, as a kind of life path. But because my experience had been so crushing, and crushing in a particular way, as I said, which I think was to do with power, and there was a very profound understanding that whatever this is, this story that I am in, which outside of this brief moment, this story, the way I have power, the way I don't have power, the story I am receiving from my culture about what value I have, it's not the story I choose to be in. I reject it. So my physical response, so that was an internal response, and it was very, very precise. My physical response was to take a biblical phrase, shake the dust from my feet and leave that place behind me. So in a decision that may seem odd, I hitchhiked to the end of the country. Just to clarify that I'd not been safe in a taxi. So I think at that point I thought, you know, I'm either safe or I'm not safe, but I'm running. And I was not a middle-class girl. I did not have the funds to get on a plane, so I hitchhiked. I knew just simply that I needed to be somewhere else in order to become someone else in a different story. So then I got on a fishing trawler in the Timor Sea and became a deckhand. And because I removed myself in a kind of circuit breaker, an extreme one, as I said, not necessarily recommended, and carried with me a lifetime of reading, I was able to remake my story and to become someone else in a very different story.
And that's what's so glorious about Fury, of course, when you read it, that you see where Kathryn came from and the double trauma that she'd experienced of the assault itself and then the experience with the justice system, what she took from that and how she reinvented herself and recovered from that is kind of the greatest answer, I think, to the greatest response to that terrible feeling of powerlessness that you had experienced with both of those.
Yes,
incidents.
it was and is a very grand middle finger. So yeah, that. But again, I'm not recommending that as the process to go through.
Louise, I'd like to talk to you a little bit now about your experiences. I'm just going to wait until I can see you. Yes, can you see me too?
I can, yeah.
Okay, so you've had, as it were, double experience, and you write about this in your book Witness. You've spoken to, in your role as an investigative journalist with the ABC, you've spoken to and been involved with a lot of complainants in sexual assault cases. You write about the Saxon Mullins case, you write about various other cases. But in addition to that, you've had experience yourself as a witness, as you say, in the committal proceedings for George Pell. You were a witness, and it was important for the barrister to discredit you. So I'm going to start by asking you about your experience as a witness in the witness box. So you were cross-examined by Robert Richter QC, who had quite the reputation even then. He was appearing for Cardinal Pell in the committal proceedings, and you were a really critical witness. So his brief was really to demolish, I want to say your evidence, but almost to demolish you as well. Could you tell us about that experience of being a witness and being cross-examined?
Yeah, I felt it was kind of like a 2-for-1 kind of thing, like, because defamation proceedings were probably not going to happen while criminal proceedings were happening. So, might as well, go for me in the witness box at the same time. That is just my opinion, of course. I just want to start by saying to Kathryn, like, I've heard hundreds of survivors' accounts of what happened to them, in the crime and what happened to them in the witness box. And, hearing yours again, it's like it gets no less distressing every single time. And I'm so sorry that happened to you. Like, you did not deserve that. And, hearing those stories over and over again, I've been traveling around the country for the past sort of 5-6 years, hearing this, that's why I wanted to write Witness, because it's not right. Like, this should not be happening to people. There is another way. I don't think that the system is so immovable that it has to be so brutalizing for witnesses. In my case, there's a provision in the Evidence Act at Section 41, and it prohibits improper questioning. And I'm going to read it out for the sake of precision, because I don't like to get things wrong. But it says, an improper question should be defined as a question that is misleading or confusing, or is annoying, harassing, intimidating, offensive, humiliating, inappropriate, or has no other basis than a sexual, racial, cultural, or ethnic stereotype. I have to say that, having read lots and lots of transcripts and having been in this experience myself, there was almost no question, particularly when you think about it in terms of tone, as opposed to just the substance of the words, that didn't in some way fall into that during the full day of cross-examination that I had. It was absolutely relentless. The tone never, ever gave up. I was treated with suspicion and derision and sexism at times. I mean, I remember
that example, Louise, of where it was put to you that you'd been flirting with a complainant, you'd been communicating with in writing.
That's right. So the man who was the reason I was there, the witness of first complaint, Richter referred to some text messages or emails, I think both, that I had with this man, and tried to suggest that I had been flirting. And I said words to the effect of, I find that a profoundly sexist assertion. And I turned to the magistrate and I asked that Mr. Richter withdraw it at once. I had been given good advice, which was not to speak to him, to speak to the magistrate, which drove him absolutely nuts. But you know, it was just like this idea that what he perceived as a sort of a young woman who fits into a particular box, in being kind and how shall I say, empathetic to someone who is telling them a great trauma that they have kept secret because they come from a family that doesn't really talk about things, that would be perceived as flirting. In fact, it was no different to the correspondence or emails, text messages that I had, for instance, with one of the choir boys' mothers. Her son had died, and I always spoke to her in exactly the same tone. But, you know, it was just this idea, like, I mean, I think that these trials of this was a committal proceeding, but these cases are a profoundly sexist place. And these defence counsel are used to asking questions like the ridiculous thing about Kathryn's underwear that are profoundly sexist. And so I think he was sort of lulled into a false sense of almost security, because that's just the way he would operate all of the time, that he could speak to me in the same way.
You called him out, Louise, didn't you? You said to him, that's not a question you would have.
I did call him out, and I remember at the time it sort of went nuts on Twitter and all of that sort of thing. You know, I said it was a really sexist assertion, and he, you know, he did back down after that, but he didn't back down in his general sort of thesis on me. I was a journalist doing my job, listening to people, applying the same forensic rigor that I do with any other story. However, when someone is making a complaint of such a, you know, terrible thing, you treat them with dignity and respect. You listen to them, and that's all that I did. But that day, oh my goodness, I remember, and you know, I've said this before, but at the end of the day, the Crown and the police and my friends and family who were in the courtroom all said, you know, that I did incredibly well in the witness box. And I felt that I did. Like, by the end of it, he was kind of jumping up and down and kind of snorting, and he
sounds like it's a good sign that you've got under his skin.
He wasn't his best self by the end of the day, and he just kind of harumphed at the end of it all. But I went home, and I remember the next day waking up, and I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't move, couldn't get up to get a glass of water. I was so traumatized by this experience. And what kept going through my head was thinking about the poor people that were going through that and reliving possibly the worst thing that had ever happened to them in their lives, having to go through the scarifying detail of that offence. And I'm talking in the broad here, like about all people who find themselves in this situation. And I just felt so profoundly sad. I mean, all the way through it, I was worrying that I was going to let these people down, you know, and I resolved in my mind that once this was all over, and, you know, once, frankly, I recovered from, you know, and I don't want to make this about me, but the secondary trauma of hearing all of these experiences and coming against such huge power, which I've had again, that I would write about it, that I'd write a book about it, because I think it needs to change.
One of the things you say is that you were very conscious that you had all of the ABC, although as a witness you didn't have your own lawyer, and we're going to come back to that later when we talk about things that might have helped to make the experience better. You did have the benefit of the top legal advice from top QC before you went into court. There was a lawyer in the court for the ABC who was able to jump up on his feet. It was him a number of times to protect you. But you say in the book that what you kept thinking was, what about people less fortunate than me? Here am I. First of all, I'm not actually a complainant. I wasn't a victim of sexual assault. And secondly, I've got the benefit of, you know, the ABC's best legal and other brains. But what did it make you think about people who are in a, I don't want to use the word privilege, a less fortunate position than you in that respect? All of the people that you've spoken to, so many complainants. How did your own experience make you then reflect back on what they had gone through?
Well, look, I mean, I'm happy to use the word privileged. I am privileged. You know, I'm a journalist. I have a law degree. I had that advice of an amazing QC, and I had the lawyer in court. These people had none of that. And, you know, and when I say these people, and I just want to keep referring to the broad, I don't want to sort of talk about the specific complainants in that case. But in many of these cases, what has been described to me in my research is that they just get often a quite cursory preparation for this experience from the Crown Prosecutor and or the police. And they have no idea about what they're about to face. And the classic example of this is Paris Street, who I write about in the book, who was the young man at St. Kevin's College. And we did a Four Corners story about that, which led to—
Tell us a bit about that story, Louise. That's a fascinating one. Just briefly, if you wouldn't mind. But
sure.
What the allegations were that he made, and then what his experience was in the criminal trial against the teacher involved.
Yeah, so Paris was a teenage young student who was being coached by an athletics coach who had been employed by the school and who was grooming him, and he was found guilty by a criminal court, and he was
only 14 or 15, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was 15 when he gave his evidence in court, so he was 13 when it started, mainly 14. And the text messages or Facebook messages this guy had sent him were absolutely disgusting. And Paris was, quite an innocent sort of boy. He was very, very focused on his running. He was very studious. He's sort of, I think he was a lot more innocent than me, but he reminded me of myself. He was like a bit of an A-type personality at school, you know, and he was just focused on the task. And this guy really sent these awful messages. Paris finally, you know, to his credit, came forward and told police, and there was a case. And just like me, Paris was cross-examined by Robert Richter. And fortunately for me and for Paris, because in the magistrate's court, because this is a grooming case, it was in the lower jurisdictions, they don't have transcripts, he was given the audio of his cross-examination, and I had the opportunity to listen to that, and it went for 2 days. And I remember clicking this thing on and thinking, it can't possibly be as bad as the way he spoke to me. You know, I was fair game, you know, wanted to get the ABC, you know, yada, yada, yada. This is a 15-year-old kid in a case that, you know, there are no journalists following at the time, et cetera, et cetera. The tone was just as bad, if not worse. It was horrifying. And this poor kid, Paris was, before the experience happened, he was in a remote witness facility, which they do now to sort of protect the complainant. But he wasn't given any real preparation, except for like the police prosecutor sort of showed him this diorama of the court, like, this is where we sit, and this is where the defense sits, and this is where the judge sits, and this is what's going to happen. And Paris thought that he was going to be doing a good deed, that he was going to prevent this person from actually physically abusing other children. And he just had to get it over with. He just had to bite the bullet, go in there, and he'd be treated with, you know, respect. And all the evidence was so fundamentally stacked against his perpetrator that it would all be fine. So he had no preparation for the absolute verbal onslaught that befell him that day. And he talks about, you know, when the screen snapped off, and he just sobbed, wept, because his whole little world came crashing down. You know, everything that he thought, if you do good in the world, you know, good will happen to you. You know, he's a 15-year-old kid.
You write about that so beautifully, Louise. I found that the Saxon Mullins trial as well is unbelievable, but those really stuck out for me, those two, than the description of the Paris Street. The way that you write about it is, so poignant, and it brings it it just really does bring it home to you. I want to talk to you both. Now, mindful of the time, we're going to stop at 11:15 for questions. I just want to talk to you a bit, come back a little bit to your experience, just coming back to what happened to you. You've used words in your description and saying you felt hectored, bullied, belittled, insulted. Now, I wonder, and this is going to be relevant to what I want to ask you later, did you feel that your interests were sufficiently protected by the Crown prosecutor whose witness you effectively were? Did you feel that he, and again, it was a he in this case, protected you well enough, that he objected to questions that he should have done?
During the day, it felt endless because it was a full day and he very, very rarely intervened. Having said that, he did intervene at some key points, and I was grateful for that. He was taking a very low impact approach to the entire matter, which he did all the way through, because there was this perception, or there was a narrative, I would argue, that was being spun by the Pell side that this was a show trial. So he was trying to dampen that all down. And so, you know, what happens in that case means that, you know, he's not going to be jumping up to your defense constantly. And so he didn't. And I felt very, very much alone.
Mm.
And
what about the judge, Louise? Because you've read us that section of the Evidence Act that gives the judge a power to stop what are called improper questions. You've said today, and you've said in your book, that in your view, just about every question you were asked was improper within that definition. Was the judge active enough in restraining him and in making sure that you weren't being hectored, in your words?
So the magistrate in this case, because it was a criminal proceeding, no, that's okay, Belinda Wallington. I mean, I say this in the book, she was very, I think, very proper, and she got quite frustrated with him at times, and she did stop him at times. But when it's so relentless, I think it becomes quite difficult, and I'm talking the broad here, I think it becomes quite difficult for judicial officers because, you know, for a start, they're potentially setting up an appeal point if they keep jumping in, that there's an apprehended bias. And of course, what happened at the end of that proceeding? Richter alleged that there was an apprehended bias. And I can say, from my experience and having read the transcript of other cross-examinations and other parts of that case, I didn't see an apprehended bias at all. I saw someone who was a complete professional who was doing her job. But I spoke to Crown prosecutors for my book, and also judges, and, you know, and defence counsel as well. And, you know, lots of people did say to me, it can become quite tricky for the judge in a situation where you've got an incredibly bombastic defence counsel who just doesn't give up in that sense. So, yeah.
It's a fine line.
Yeah,
so
she was trying.
I want to come back to Kathryn now. Having heard all of that, Kathryn, have you got any other comments that you want to make? Does all of that sound painfully familiar to you?
Do you know what I thought? Am I? What the moment that I thought was really interesting, Louise, was when you said, everyone said I'd done very well. And for me, that's a kind of a real lightning prick moment, because there's an essential problem there for me, which is that it's performative. The whole structure of trials, the whole structure of, I'm sorry, the legal profession is, it's
I'm an ex-lawyer, that's why
performative.
she's saying sorry.
No, I'm not.
You don't have to say sorry.
You don't have to carry everything done. But it becomes a performative space. Which, as I said, is, you know, because it goes back to that Oxford Union model. It is performative. It is the play of attack and defense is performance, but the person who's the witness is either does well or doesn't do well. And that is to do with performance and to do with power. So the whole structure, in my case, yes, there were moments of kindness, but it's actually it's a structural problem. That the whole structure is not just sexist, but incredibly classist, incredibly problematic at its absolute foundational levels. The whole process of of court in that way. And this, I mean, you know, in the same way I would say the Westminster Parliament model, it's built on a problematic base. So yeah, I'm kind of all for dismantle the whole thing and start again. Sorry, Louise.
Louise, I'm going to now I want to ask both of you these questions. And my general question, my heading here was, what would have helped? I just want to describe what you both said in your books. Kathryn, in your book, you said when you walked out of the courtroom into the rain, you felt as though I'd been compressed and minced, pulped in a machine. Louise, you've described how you spent the following day in bed. You described the justice system as paternalistic, disappointing, and bruising. So I want to ask you both, what would have helped, in your opinions, to make the experience, and what would help going forward, to make the experience of being a witness less traumatic? Now, I'm not asking you, obviously, to give me chapter and verse of your ideas on law reform, but I'm just going to put a few things to you that we've talked about already. So both of you, and again, Louise, in this instance, I'm going to talk about your own experience as a witness. If the Crown prosecutor had spent more time with you before the trial, preparing you, telling you what cross-examination was going to involve, giving you a bit of a dry run of the sort of questions you could be likely to expect, would that have helped? Kathryn?
Okay, yes, it would have. But again, I would still hold to my really fundamental position that the structure itself is inherently problematic in terms of power, in terms of process. So for me, what would have helped would be a different process entirely, actually, one that isn't built on attack and defense, one that isn't built on the notion of property as the foundational element. Because if you have a legal system where property is the thing that is most important, so all of that was problematic for me. So I'm sorry, I would say a different model entirely. Burn it down and use some, look at other models from other cultures. But given that that's not the question you're posing to me, and you know, we might have a bit of a tired revolution if I gather the people in this room and let's take our torches. Yes, look, let's start with that. More preparation, more space within the process. I mean, the elements of both sexism and classism, and you know, how you dismantle those when you're working within a system. Sure, let's start with more preparation.
Louise, you make a couple of suggestions. I just want to ask you about both of those. I thought they're both excellent suggestions. One was, what often happens in these cases is, of course, that the complainant gives their evidence remotely. So the person who's the victim of the sexual assault gives their evidence remotely. And you look at that and you say, well, that seems a bit unfair, really. Why should they be absent from the room? And one suggestion you have is, why not flip it and have the complainant in the room with the judge, with the jury, with the public, and let's remove the accused from the room and let them give. So whilst the complainant is giving their evidence, let's remove the accused from the room. Have you talked about that with lawyers and had their response to that?
Yeah, the response was mixed. I mean, what I think is talking to a lot of prosecutors, they talk about how they have reservations, and defense counsel will talk about this as well. Defense counsel will say there is nothing better than having a complainant in a remote witness facility, because the jury doesn't sort of relate to them on that fundamental level that when someone's in the room, you know. So the Crown will say, I always, if I can, try and get them in the room, but you know, you have to sort of like walk on eggshells. And you know, what I think about this is that a lot of the law reform, and this is just my opinion, and some people disagree with this, but I feel like a lot of the law reform in this area has been a bit paternalistic and infantilizing of complainants. And I think that they should be given more agency, and they should be given the opportunity to be in the courtroom. They have nothing to be ashamed of. They have nothing to hide. They still have the right to anonymity at law. You know, their name doesn't have to be in the press and so on, but to have that sort of personal interaction with the jury. And at the moment, the jury is given a warning about why the complainant's not in the room. It's potentially to protect them. Well, the same warning could be given about taking the accused out of the room. I mean, the thing is, the accused gets to sit through the entire trial, take notes, say things to their barrister, et cetera, has the right to not give evidence, to remain silent. So that point about Kathryn, you're not on trial. Well, actually, a lot of the time it is the complainant on trial because the accused is never actually cross-examined.
Yeah.
Doesn't have to go through that same horrible experience. So that's one thing. Another thing I suggest is that they should have a lawyer. They don't necessarily.
That was the next one I wanted to ask you about. That seemed like a really fantastic suggestion to me.
Yeah.
That the complainant have their own lawyer protecting their own rights.
Yes.
Again, you talked to lawyers about that, defence lawyers and Crown prosecutors. What sort of reception have you had to that suggestion?
Some liked it and were fine about it. Some hated it and said that it's sort of like reverse the onus of proof and that sort of thing. They're so used to the architecture of this system that I think that they feel like this would just ruin the whole proceeding, However, I mean, it doesn't have to be someone sitting at the bar table being a party, because the complainant is not a party. The matter is between the state and the accused. So it's about having a lawyer in the space to make sure that the Evidence Act is not being breached. Because a lot of the time it's to do with tone, not substance. And, in terms of an appeal or a complaint or that sort of thing after the fact, it's quite hard to see it on a transcript, And I think that it would keep people on their toes. Another really fantastic initiative, which I'm so pleased about, in Victoria, there's just been a Law Reform Commission inquiry into this whole bit broader issue. It had just started as I was sort of like working on Witness, is the idea that there be ground rules hearings. So in Victoria at the moment, there is, if the complainant is vulnerable, so under the age of 18, this is quite a new thing, it's a pilot program, or intellectually disabled, autistic, people who have some sort of vulnerability in some way, they hold a hearing beforehand, like a voir dire before the jury comes into the room, and the judge and the Crown and the defence sit down and work out, these are the rules of engagement. These are the things that we can't do, we can do. And by all accounts from the people, including judges that I've spoken to about this, it has really improved the way that Defence Counsel behave, and Defence Counsel who thought that, it was going to mean that they were always, going to get convictions. It hasn't necessarily happened that way, because the bottom line is, if the evidence is there, the evidence is there. So they're now going to do that. If the Victorian government takes up this proposal, they're now going to do that in all cases. And my thesis in Witness is that all complainants of sexual crimes are vulnerable. No matter how tough they are, no matter how privileged they are, or educated or anything, they're reliving this terrible experience. And so they need to be treated with a bit more dignity and respect, because there is no other place in our society where people are treated in this way. Parliament is the closest thing. In Parliament, they're not reliving trauma.
No.
They're politicians arguing about policy. In this situation, they're just so broken often. It's taken years of therapy to get them there, and it takes years of therapy on the way out. And I talked to psychologists about this, who said that often, there are suicide attempts after the trial, even though a conviction was secured. Well, that's a terrible indictment on the system, and it shouldn't continue to happen.
Kathryn, just one last question for you. Your experience, horrendous as it was, led to you changing your life, taking control of your life and reinventing yourself. So I wondered then, even given what a traumatic, dreadful experience it was for you, whether now looking back and looking what you've done with your life since, whether you have any regrets about reporting the crime and pressing charges. Would you do it again?
Oh, gee, that's so tricky, isn't it? Because as I said, really what I did was say, as I've said today, I reject the terms of the argument. I reject the terms of the story. So for me, that was one of the things that became, in story terms, the inciting incident to creating a new and successful and magnificent story. Would I propose that as a great inciting incident for other young women? Categorically not. Would I encourage the young woman version of me now to go through that same process? What I do know, the reason that I kind of, when you mentioned the machete, the reason that I said actually what I say afterwards is I don't have a machete, I just have words, thousands and thousands of them now. One of the things that going through that process does, and Louise, your proposals are potentially ways of working within the quite broken system to perhaps make this more possible. But having an opportunity to speak the story, to articulate the experience, can be, at its best, can be empowering and powerful. I will just say one thing. I did an event about Fury, a reading, and someone came up to me afterwards and said that she'd read Fury, and so she knew what had happened. And she said, the same thing happened to me. And she thought it was the year before. So, and she said, by a taxi driver in Sydney. So she said, and I wonder if it was the same person. So of course, that made me think, well, maybe I was the person who stopped that happening. Still, I cannot say, would I encourage someone else to go through that process?
I'm going to pause now. You've heard enough from me, and open it up to you and to viewers at home watching or through libraries. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask either Kathryn or Louise, or both of them, arising from what we've talked about? Yes, the woman in the green top. I've just been asked to repeat all questions so that people at home can hear them. The question was basically, it was an incredibly gutsy thing to do, to hitchhike, to get on a trawler with a bunch of men. And you wait till you read about it in the book. It's with a bunch of 4 men. So the question was that a deliberate response of yours to what you'd been through?
Well, I would say I don't think anything was deliberate at that point. I was responding, again, almost physiologically. If you think of, a sort of like, I don't want to speak ill of myself then, but like a single-celled organism responding to light or repulsion. I just knew, as I say in the book, I hadn't yet read Philip Larkin's The Importance of Elsewhere, but I knew on some level that if I could remove myself from what I was in, from everything known to me, what was known to me was not working and was damaging me, and I was damaged. So it was entirely instinctive, actually. Again, would I encourage my now 22-year-old daughter to hitchhike into the wild unknown? No. But I do say, when you say, trawlers are not known for being great environments for women, what I needed to do, and this was a result really of that court experience, actually, I knew on some level I needed to build muscle. I needed to be stronger and more powerful. I needed to build both physical and psychological muscle. As it turned out for me, physical hard work, physical danger, great danger, was a way of doing that. I was in danger a lot on that little boat in the worst season that the Gulf had ever known, but I was never in danger from my crewmates for one reason. There's one moment where I talk about going up on the bow deck and seeing scores and scores and scores of sharks. And it just happened that that day was the day, earlier that day, I'd leapt into the sea from the A-frame of the trawler. Yeah, again, I'm not going to be encouraging that someone else to do that. It is but that moment of looking down and thinking, they are always there, those sharks. I don't want to conflate. It's unfair on sharks. Sharks are not rapists, but they are there. I was not their prey when I was swimming earlier. And that kind of moment of thinking, these men, my crewmates, I have not been in danger from them in the ways we are speaking. I've not been in danger from them sexually, of receiving unwanted sexual advances for one reason. They were not rapists. That's it. Not a decision I made, not anything I wore, anything I did do or didn't do. It was entirely to do with what they did or didn't do. So that if there was a decision, it was I haven't been safe in a context when I should have been safe. So
Any other questions? Yes, up the back with black mask. Louise, that was a huge thank you from someone who said shall I give the name of, you're a friend of Chrissy Foster's, and to say thank you so much to you for the work that you've done. So it wasn't a question, it was just a huge thank you. Oh no, there is a question coming, sorry. Thank you so much for sharing that. The person asking the question has explained that they've been through some very traumatic experiences themselves and how important it is to speak up, and thanking Kathryn for speaking up.
The burning it down, what suggestion? You in?
The person asking the question has said that she agrees entirely with all of the things that Kathryn has suggested. And she asked you, Kathryn, I think you may have talked about this, whether you'd since become aware of any other attacks by taxi drivers. So you've given one example.
It's not actually an uncommon. It's not as uncommon as we might have hoped. And you know, so I don't know in that same era by that same driver, but you know, in recent years, absolutely. I mean, in the UK where I lived for a long time, minicab assaults. I mean, it had its own term. So not black cabs. Black cabs are kind of built so that's very, very unlikely. But minicabs, that was common. And it's one of the reasons that just on taxi driver fronts, I'm a fan of Uber. But I'm not a fan of their employment practices. Sorry, but just it's trackable.
We might have room for one quick last question. Yes, there's one. Okay, thank you so much. This is from Kim online. Is there a lack of awareness amongst the legal profession and judiciary about the impacts of trauma on complainants, and how that might affect their evidence? So is there a lack of awareness amongst the legal profession and the judiciary? And I guess my next question would be, what can we do about that? Louise, I'll put that one to you first.
Look, I think there is a sort of la, 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 la. I just don't want to know about this because it's too hard basket, and how are we even going to deal with this? And it's just going to ruin the whole system if we start trying to pick it apart, and people won't get a fair trial and all of that sort of stuff. There are people who definitely acknowledge this and who feel bad about it. And in fact, I spoke to barristers who stopped working in this area because they couldn't go home to their children at night after doing this to people. But I do think that there's still a real sort of like, oh, well, you know, it's not the perfect system, but it's the best system we've got. And people sort of really jump to the defense. I have been gratified that I have been approached by barristers to sort of like give talks and talk about professional development and that sort of thing. And, you know, for example, the Bar News, was really good in Victoria, sort of promoting the book and whatever. But there were elements, I know, who were really upset about it because they just don't want to know. But
Louise, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you. I'm very unfortunately going to have to stop you there. Time has run out here. Please, everybody, thank me. Sorry. Let's start again. Don't thank me, please. Thank our fabulous guests, Kathryn Heyman here in person, Louise Milligan on the Zoom, for joining us today, for a really fascinating insight from both of you. So thank you so much, both of you, for sharing. Now, Kathryn will be available to sign copies of her books opposite the library bookshop just outside this room. Could you leave this room at the end of the session, even if you've got another session in here, because the room needs to be cleared? And most importantly, enjoy the rest of the festival. Tickets to other festivals are for sale at the festival reception table opposite the library cafe. So thank you very much, everybody.